I've tested a ton of microscopes over the years. In this video, I'm gonna let you know which are my favorites from 2024, what pitfalls to avoid, and how to find the best microscope for your use case. You might even already have our favorite microscope of the year in your pockets right now. There are a couple of different categories. You have your mobile microscopes for the inexpensive, low magnification, on-the-go applications, digital microscopes, which are also inexpensive, easy to use, and are going to give you kind of a low to medium magnification. They would either have a screen on them directly like this one, or they would have a USB cable that plugs into a computer, or they would even have an HDMI cable that plugs into a big screen TV. The samples that would work best under a digital microscope are samples like fabrics, or if you're doing electronics inspection of PCBs, or even looking at your fingerprint. And then we have stereo microscopes, which fill a very similar niche to the digital microscopes, but you look through the eyepieces and they give you a three-dimensional vision under the microscope, which lets you do physical manipulations such as soldering or watchmaking, jewelry making, and so on. And then finally, we have compound microscopes. These are probably the things that you picture in your head when you think of the word microscope. They're more expensive, a little bit more involved to use, but they give you really high magnifications. You would need to use a compound microscope if you're looking at things like pond water samples, blood samples, any kind of biological samples are really what compound microscopes excel at. The biggest tip that I have for microscope purchasing, higher magnification and more expensive microscopes might not necessarily be better. A $20 microscope might work better for your application than using a $1,000 microscope. Really, you have to match the right magnification and the right type of microscope to the samples that you're using. Using too high of a magnification for a low magnification sample is like pressing your face right up against a big screen TV and then trying to watch a movie on it. I've labeled all of the different chapters of this video, and as always, all of the microscopes that I recommend will have purchase links in the video description below. To test these microscopes out, we're going to use a couple of different samples. A crisp $20 bill. We're going to look at the tip of a ballpoint pen so you can get a sense of scale. And then we're also going to look at one of our products. This is Micro Safari Terra, which is basically, it's a giant microscope slide that comes shipped with an entire living ecosystem inside of it. You can feed your organisms, watch them eat each other, reproduce, and adapt. It makes a great gift. Mobile microscopes are super convenient, cheap, and work surprisingly well. Even with access to all of the rest of the microscopes that we have, I still find myself using mobile microscopes just as much as the more expensive ones. Mobile microscopes make great gifts for kids, but can also be used professionally. I've got to do some expectation setting here though. You aren't going to be looking at bacteria or getting a 1000x magnification with a $20 mobile microscope. For most everyday samples though, you don't really need those kind of capabilities. The capabilities of your phone are going to determine how good of a mobile microscope experience you have, and in fact, the fancier phones typically end up just being more of a pain in the butt than the less fancy phones do. Also, if you're carrying around a big thick case on your phone, you might have trouble getting the mobile microscope to fit over that case. Our big winner for 2024 is the Carson Micro Bright. I love this microscope. This thing has blown me out of the water. The first time that I looked through it, I was shocked that you could actually get this level of performance out of a mobile microscope. When you compare it to this Bang Amazon microscope that looks effectively identical in terms of the magnification, where the buttons and everything, the mechanical design is laid out, there is still a huge difference between these two microscopes. The level of optical quality is substantially better on the Carson Micro Bright. The magnification range you get on this is claimed to be 60x to 120x. There's this little slider which is physically moving a lens element inside of this microscope. And these magnification numbers, I do actually believe them. A lot of times you'll see these less expensive microscopes give these wild numbers, 1,000 times magnification, which makes no sense. As is the same case with any of these other mobile microscopes, the samples that are going to work best with the Carson Micro Bright Plus are samples that, number one, are reflected light samples. There's a little LED that reflects off the sample, and then that light bounces back up into the objective. So these samples are going to be large insects, plant parts. Maybe you're like looking at the bark of a tree or something like that. You could be looking at a knife's edge, ballpoint pen, of course, and really anything that you can see with your own naked eye, just magnified to a much greater extent. The focus knob on this microscope is buttery smooth, feels really good. The overall build quality of it is super solid, especially for the price point. I mean, this thing is 20 bucks, fantastic. The other thing that really blew me away though is how large this opening for you to look inside of it with your eyes are. It's actually a very comfortable viewing experience, which I was quite shocked about. I would say the biggest downside of this is that when you put the smartphone clip on it, it's very front heavy as well. So it feels a little bit bulky. It's hard to keep the thing still enough to get a good image. And then also just because of the physical form factor of you trying to look at stuff, you're holding this with your hands. And so if you're at that highest 120 times magnification, it's going to be a little bit difficult to hold the thing still enough to not have it shake around. Our number 2 spot for mobile microscopes goes to this black generic mobile microscope model that you can buy on AliExpress for a couple dollars, get it on Amazon for about $10. Overall, just a good, solid option. It's very simple, it works well, the magnification is at just the right sweet spot where it's enough that you can see things that you can't see with your naked eye, but it's not such a high magnification that you get a bunch of practical difficulties in using this thing. Number 2 is that it has a really good form factor to it. I really love that it has this clamping action which turns on the LED at the same time. The weight distribution of this is really great. It won't try and walk off your phone because it is balanced and it doesn't stick out that far from your phone. I mean, you are only paying around $10 for this thing, so don't expect it to work as well as a $90 microscope does, but for that $10, you're really getting quite a bit of capabilities. One of the challenges you are going to find with this mobile microscope, and in fact, you're really going to find it with any mobile microscope, is that using more expensive phones are going to be trickier because they have fancy features around the camera where, for example, it shoots a beam of light and then waits to see how long that beam of light travels back from your sample. So it's using that to calculate the distance and then figure out which camera lens it needs to use. And so you'll end up covering the time of flight sensor and it'll end up erroneously just changing to different camera lenses on your phone. And then our final mobile microscope pick for the year is the iPhone 15 Pro. The macro mode on this phone is incredibly good and frankly gives about the same level of magnification that you can get from one of these black generic mobile microscopes. This thing works incredibly well. So I mean, just the fact that you already have it in your pocket, if you're willing to shell out $1,000 on a phone, you get some pretty incredible capabilities. And the software functionality that they put into this is amazing. The focus range that you can do is incredible. It does a lot of automatic improvements to the image quality, stabilization, that kind of stuff. So this is our pick since you might already even have it in your pocket. Digital microscopes are a great learning tool for kids, but can also be used professionally. In fact, last week, I saw a digital microscope being used at a TSA checkpoint. What they were doing with it? Who knows? The kind of samples that work best on digital microscopes are insects, coins, electronics, fabrics, and so on. The things that you can see with the naked eye, but when you actually magnify it under a microscope, you see a whole new realm of the textures and features that you wouldn't otherwise be able to see with your naked eye. We have about one new digital microscope company that's emailing us every single week asking to review their new random coin microscope. And although some of them are complete garbage, there are some very nice digital microscopes. Admittedly, digital microscopy is getting much better and cheaper at a higher rate than any other microscope category because the electronics inside of the digital microscopes are themselves getting better because they're following the improvements in smartphone technology and other microelectronics improvements over the years. Most of these new digital microscopes have integrated lithium batteries inside of them, so you can take them on the go and you don't even need to plug them in. The image sensors themselves are also getting better, the overall frame rate and the quality of the image that you get. A couple of warnings: beware of claims of these microscopes giving you anything really above 200 times magnification. If it says 1600 times magnification on it, that is a lie, or at least misleading at best. Number 2 is you get what you pay for in this category. If it seems too good to be true, it probably is, and you're likely gonna get a Fisher-Price quality microscope. Unfortunately, with so many knockoffs and identical looking Chinese products finding their way onto the market, you can find microscopes that look identical but give vastly different image qualities and overall user experiences. When people are looking at microscopes, they usually will just compare the image qualities, maybe they'll compare how many megapixels are that they did on it. The thing they really overlook though is how important the build quality of the stand is. So for example, this was one of the microscopes that we actually featured in one of the previous year's videos. The image quality was great, but one of the issues that we found as we played around with it more and more is that these goosenecks, the illuminator goosenecks, just wouldn't hold their position. So you put it in here and you can see how it's kind of springing back. over and over again, and it basically makes the goosenecks almost unusable. Same thing goes for the focus knobs. If you use the focus knobs and it moves the entire thing around, it's going to be a very difficult time actually using the microscope in the first place. So whether or not it has a good image quality doesn't really matter. The least expensive and best digital microscope that I've found over the years is this pluggable microscope. This comes in at about $40, and it has great frame rate. It has a pretty good image quality. The base is nice and solid for $40. It has a rotatable focus knob on it. Unfortunately, it does have a gooseneck style stand, which if you go and you just move it, you can see how it vibrates. If you can see the microscope vibrating with the naked eye at our macro scale, under the microscope, the thing's just going to be jiggling around quite a lot. So that's really the biggest downside to this microscope. But otherwise, for the price, the image quality, super solid. It is a USB only option here. And basically when you plug this into your computer is going to think that it's a webcam. So just think about it like it's a webcam. On Windows, you can go to the camera app, open it up, it should just work. And on Macs, they have a similar thing. I believe it's called the Photo Booth app. And then we have the Matata Studio M2B. This is my pick for the kind of middle of the road digital microscope that has a screen on it. It's got a surprisingly good image for the price. I believe this comes in around $90. And the build quality of it is pretty solid. Nice metal stand. It all feels really good. The focus knob is nice and smooth. I really recommend this microscope for kids especially. I can imagine a bunch of 10-year-olds basically crowding around this thing as they're, looking at little bugs under here and really having a good time with it. The form factor is really nice and small, which I actually like. The screen isn't very large, but you can still get quite a lot of detail out of that screen. It is battery powered as well, so you can take this on the go, but it works a lot better as a kind of stationary unit. For the same price, if you are going to be using it more portably, I'd recommend this Star portable microscope. So this one is really built as a portable digital microscope. First, this comes in at the same $90 price point. I would say that the image quality is basically identical between the two. Really, the only difference in the user experience is just that this is a portable kind of microscope and this one isn't. So this one's been great. Been using it for a couple of years now. We also like this one quite a lot. One other thing I did not mention, this portable Star one, this does actually come with a stand. And then our premium option for the year is this Star AD246S-M. They get some points taken away for having a hard to remember product number, but otherwise the actual microscope itself is really nice. This microscope is fantastic. We've been using Star products for years now. Ever since the ADSM 302, we've loved Star products. We've actually had an ADSM 302, one of the previous Star microscopes, in a museum exhibit that has been running for 5 years straight. So the coolest features about this microscope are that it has this new exchangeable objective system. So you can go loosen up these little screws here. And then once you do that, you can pull out this entire little assembly, and you can see there's a little objective at the very bottom of it. And you can swap this for other higher magnification objectives. So depending on what you're actually observing, you can put in an objective that matches what you're looking at. What a crazy idea. The overall build quality of the thing, fantastic. The stand is awesome. Very smooth, precise action. When you set it to a certain focal distance, it just holds its spot. The goosenecks also hold its spot pretty much as well as a gooseneck is ever going to do. The focus on it is buttery smooth. It's got a giant screen on it. It has an HDMI output, so you can put it up to a big screen TV, which, it's almost already has a big screen TV with how huge this thing is. You record onto a little SD card, and really, this thing is just, it's overall around super solid. Love you, Star. You're doing great work. Compound microscopes are defined by their compound objectives, usually on a rotating turret. If you want to go up in magnification, you have to rotate up a higher magnification objective. Compound microscopes are the most sophisticated of all of the microscope categories that we've talked about thus far. And really, the more money that you spend, usually the more capabilities you get, such as having a condenser or having a mechanical stage, rather than getting better image quality or more magnification per se. A prime example of this is that the image quality you can get from the $300 trinocular Swift microscope is 90% as good as what you can get from the $100,000 Zeiss microscope. With this Zeiss microscope, though, you get motorized, automated capabilities, and that's really where the costs come from, not necessarily from it having really that much better of image quality. Most compound microscopes are transmitted light microscopes, meaning that the light passes up through the sample. Due to the precise optics required for high magnifications, samples for compound microscopes generally have to be in an infinitesimally thin slice that light can pass through, and are placed on a microscope slide and cover slip to make it easier to handle the sample and to keep everything within that optical focal plane. I'm going to give my winners for this category in order of increasing price so that you can kind of fit yourself in with what your budget is. And I'd say generally, don't bother buying a compound microscope for anything less than $80. At that price point, those microscopes are going to have terrible image quality, are going to be extremely hard to use, and are going to be of Fisher Price quality. You'd be much better off spending that money on a good mobile microscope or a good digital microscope. For $100, you can get the Swift monocular microscope. I really like this microscope, actually. There are a couple of features that you get for $100 that are pretty great to get at this price point, actually. So you have a nice firm metal stage, you have dual zoom features, so one of them is a coarse focus, one of them is a fine focus. The quality of the image on the objectives is actually quite good on these. It also has a reflected light illuminator, so there's a switch on the back. You can switch between reflected and transmitted mode. Surprising, I'm really shocked that more microscopes don't have a reflected light illuminator just thrown on there. It's not like it's really that much more expensive. But this Swift microscope is actually the same exact microscope that we are using as the base microscope for our Horizons Lite Kit and our Sperm Observation Kit. We're buying it from the same original manufacturer that Swift is purchasing it from. At the next price point up, I would recommend going with the $250 AmScope binocular microscope. So at this price point, you get 2 eyepieces, you get an additional objective on the objective turret. You now have an oil immersion objective, which gives you a much higher magnification, albeit with a lot more added difficulty and challenge. You get a mechanical stage, which is really critical for just the user experience of it. It's very hard to precisely move your sample around microscopic distances with just your hands. And then you also have a condenser on the bottom, which gives you better control over the illumination of your sample. Unfortunately, with this model, you do actually lose an upgrade. There's no longer a reflected light illuminator on this. For $350, you can upgrade to the Swift trinocular microscope. Now I know that these both look pretty much the same. They both have mechanical stages, condensers. Four objectives on the turret, all with actually the exact same magnifications. But there are some important differences between these two that do make a big difference for the user experience. This Swift microscope uses wide field eyepieces, which are just frankly way more pleasant to look through, and they give you a wider field of view when you're looking at the images. You also get a trinocular port so that you can put a microscope camera up to this microscope and you can be recording while you're looking through the eyepieces. And now there is some improvement in image quality from this microscope. I don't know exactly where it's coming from. I believe it's probably coming from the objectives though. And if you're thinking that this microscope looks familiar, well, you'd be right. This is the exact same base microscope that we're using in our Horizons kit. Swift, AmScope, and most of the other manufacturers are all buying their microscopes from the same manufacturers on the same street in Shenzhen, China, and then they're slapping their sticker on it. So to be clear, this is the Swift version of this microscope, so we can't actually look at Microscope Terra or this $20 bill or the ballpoint pen tip because there's no reflected light illumination. But I'm going to throw on the reflected light illuminator that's included with our Horizons kit so that we can actually look at these samples. For $1,000, you can get a microscope like this. Unfortunately, I don't have a model number or a link to direct you to because this is a sample from our manufacturer, but I did want to at least run you through the features that you can expect to get at a microscope that costs $1,000 if you buy it from Amscope or otherwise. The features that you can expect to get are, number one, a set of ultra wide field eyepieces. And let me just tell you, this is a delight. Secondly, you get higher quality infinity plan objectives, which, number one, give you better image quality, but number two, also allow you to do upgrades in the future, such as adding in phase contrast to this microscope or adding in true, cooler dark field. Speaking of which, this microscope also has cooler illumination. You might have run into that word if you're doing microscope purchasing research. Essentially, what cooler illumination does is that it removes background noise from your microscope image. So any dust that's in your microscope optical path will be just totally gotten rid of. It won't cause any shadows to form in your final image there. And if you have $100,000 laying around, you can get a big chunker like this thing. This is the Zeiss Axio Imager that I found in a basement. If you want to hear that full story, you can check out the I opened up a $100,000 microscope video to see the inside of this and see how it works. And the reason why this microscope costs $100,000 is that it's mostly a bespoke automated microscope system that was designed and built for a medical device manufacturing company. It has motorized XY staging on here, it has a motorized objective turret, even the condenser lens system is motorized. I mean, this really has all of the bells and whistles that you would want out of a microscope that costs this much money. I have to say though, this microscope I have a love-hate relationship with. It's kind of a giant pain in my butt, both because it breaks your back every time you try and move it. This thing is like 50 pounds. And also it takes like 20 to 30 minutes to set it up to look at a single sample. And the image quality is really not that much better than the $300 Swift microscope. Unless you are diagnosing cancer, you don't need to spend that much money on a microscope. Stereo microscopes are what you're going to want to use if you're doing soldering, jewelry making, inspecting 3D objects, or anything else that requires some kind of a manual manipulation under a microscope. The big thing about stereo microscopes is that they give you 3D vision under a microscope, which is really cool. For this category, I have mostly helpful advice to give you. I don't have a ton of different brands to compare. I'm really going to be just directing you to Amscope because they are just a really solid supplier of imported microscopes. By the way, these are all samples from our manufacturer. That's why you don't see any kind of brand logoing on any of these ones. But if you compare them to what Amscope has, it's going to be the identical same model, maybe with a slight different feature here or there, and the Amscope label printed on them. The three different price points we have out in front of me are around $90, $300, and then this one's about $600. So really the price difference comes from mostly the stands themselves. The stand on a stereo microscope is going to make the biggest difference by far in what your ultimate experience of using the product is. The next huge thing that's going to make a difference in your experience is the diameter of the eyepieces. So if you look and you compare these two together, they are pretty substantially different. And so what it means for the final user experience is that you don't need to have your eyes so perfectly right over the eyepiece. You can, be shifting a little bit to the right or to the left, and you'll still be able to see inside of the microscope just fine when it's a bigger diameter. The next thing is whether or not your microscope has a fixed zoom option or it has a continuous zoom option. And then the final piece of advice I have for you is don't get too high of a magnification. If you're doing soldering or otherwise, if you're too zoomed in, you're not going to be able to see what you're doing, right? So it's the same analogy where if you're trying to watch a movie on a big screen TV, but you have your nose up against the screen, that has too much magnification. You don't want to be doing that. But in this case, I would say 45 times, great place to be if you're doing any kind of manual manipulation. And then if you're doing more inspection type work, I would say 90 times is pretty much the limit of what this kind of microscope is going to be able to support. Because, going back to microscope fundamentals here, the higher the magnification is, the shorter the depth of field becomes, and the more critical illumination becomes, and then also the harder it is to physically move stuff around on the microscope and be able to just see what you're doing. I'm only going to record this on one of them because The image quality is effectively identical between the two. Really, the big difference is just the stand. This one does have that continuous zoom knob, which is real nice though. You know, taking a video on this doesn't really do it justice. The real experience is being able to look through two eyepieces at the same time. You can tell even with this more sturdy stand, you know, I'm still able to, you know, jiggle the table and touch this thing and get it to move. Next up we got the Terra. The ring light illumination is really not ideal for Terra because it has quite a bit of water droplets inside of it, and the ring lights create glare off of each of those individual little water droplets. And admittedly, this looks kind of like garbage. It really, let me tell you, it looks very good when you're looking at it just with your own eyes. I unfortunately don't have an assortment of cameras from different manufacturers to recommend to you. I can give you general advice when you're looking for a microscope camera. There are a couple of ways that you could do this. You could buy an eyepiece camera. You can also get ones that these are C-mount, so these would be threading into a trinocular port on a microscope. Or you can, you know, use your smartphone with one of these smartphone adapters, and then we have these DSLR/mirrorless camera adapters that you can again put into that trinocular port. When people first think about buying a microscope camera, the first thing that they have in their head is probably, oh, more megapixels is better, or, you know, a 4K one must be better than a 1080p one, which is sometimes correct, but I think that the situation is much more complicated than that. The megapixel count is not actually the main determining factor. There's so much more that goes into image sensors and image processing than just the megapixel count. For example, you could have a camera where it's double the amount of megapixels, but each one of those pixels is less than half as sensitive, in which case you actually get a noisier, lower resolution image than you would with the camera that has fewer megapixels. I think some more expectation setting is in order here. You are not going to be taking photos of a quality that you would see in, you know, Journey to the Microcosmos or these other super high-end productions using a, you know, $200-300 microscope camera. I mean, they're using cameras that cost a couple $1,000s and are really specifically optimized to the microscopes that they're using. I think that cameras are overall the hardest category to give recommendations for because one camera might work really well with one specific kind of microscope, but then completely not work with the other kind. And that comes down to just the physical process of how these cameras and the sensors work. For example, some microscopes might be providing a very small amount of light, and if you're pairing that with a camera that requires a lot of light, you're gonna have a very bad interaction there. For the smartphone microscope adapters, I really wish that I could say that these are a perfect solution and everyone should be buying these, but I think the reality is that they just don't work that well unless you get lucky and happen to buy one that works really well combining with your microscope and your phone. This idea of having a universal smartphone microscope adapter is actually a very hard engineering problem because the alignment that is required for attaching your phone to a microscope. When you have this over, you have to have it both aligned in this direction. You have to have it aligned so that the focal distances are correct in the kind of inward and outwards direction, and then the tilt also has to be correct. Getting all of those factors to work for every single microscope and every single smartphone, where smartphones have different thicknesses, there are different cases, you have cameras that are placed in different spots, the cameras have different focal ranges on them. It makes it a very hard challenge, and I think this is why we were really reluctant in the first place to include a smartphone microscope adapter with our Horizons kit. If you go on Amazon, you'll notice that you can't find a single smartphone microscope adapter that has more than 4 stars as a rating, and that's because it just simply doesn't work for some people. And for the people that it does work for, it works incredibly well. For others, it just doesn't work pretty much at all. There is one out of this list that we do want to recommend to people, though. We were actually very surprised and blown away with it. It's just one of those random 4-star Amazon listings. The thing that really distinguishes this one as being better than the competition is that, number one, it goes internal to the eyepiece adapter tube, which keeps it significantly more stable and keeps it more aligned in the system. And then number two is that there is a lens inside of this, which makes it significantly easier to align your phone because they've engineered this lens to have the correct focal ranges that work better with a phone camera than an eyepiece would. Eyepieces are optimized for human eyes not for phone cameras. And then finally, we have DSLR or mirrorless camera adapters that usually would hook up to the trinocular port. DSLR or mirrorless camera sensors are not optimized for microscopes. Microscope cameras are optimized for microscopes. For mirrorless or DSLR cameras, the biggest issue that I've come to is a couple of things. Number one, the dynamic range on these DSLRs or mirrorless cameras are not quite as high as what smartphone cameras are able to account for. You get a lot less light on a microscope than you would imaging stuff on a regular camera. You know, cameras, if you've ever been in a photography studio, there's tons of lights. I have tons of lights all over me right now. And that's because these type of cameras, these mirrorless cameras, require a ton of light to be reaching that image sensor, and you just don't get that on a microscope unless you have, you know, a custom microscope that's just absolutely blasting your sample with light. If you happen to have a mirrorless camera already, it's definitely worth trying to buy one of these adapters because they're not that expensive. I just want to warn you, it might not work as well as you're thinking. As a general rule of thumb, the image that you're going to get off of a phone camera or a mirrorless camera or a specific microscope camera is through a microscope is not going to be nearly as good as what you're going to physically see when you look through the eyepieces. There are exceptions, however. There are certain samples that microscope cameras actually do a better job at picking up on the things that are very hard to see under that than what our eyes can do. A really good example of that is sperm. This is one of the critical parts of our Sperm Observation Kit. It's including a microscope camera that is optimized for having really good edge detection. So the problem with sperm is that they are nearly transparent. They're almost invisible. This microscope camera can essentially pick up on those very, very small changes in light and then amplify that so that when it's on a screen, you can see it much, much better than you can when you're looking through the eyepieces themselves. Here we have some of the top microscopes from each category, and our overall winner for 2024 is the Carson Micro Bright. This thing is awesome, and for $20, the experience that you get from this little thing, I'm honestly shocked. I've been using microscopes for 8 years now, and this thing is blowing me away. Obviously, these other microscopes have better quality than this $20 one, but for the price, this thing is incredible. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help me quit my day job, check us out, microsafari.org. I've invented a bunch of cool microscope products you can go see there. Here's a little discount code you can use on our website. How much is it worth? I don't even know. We haven't decided yet, so it's a mystery until you go and check. Or if you just want to skip the middleman and send me money directly, you like my work, here's my Venmo code. Why not? I don't know. I'm curious if anybody's actually going to send anything. We'll see about that. All right, anyway, see you next time. Thanks for watching.